Rendez-vous est pris pour l'Amazonie. J'ai peut-être donné la parole à Cyril Ramaphosa avant de conclure.
Thank you very much, President Macron. Let me start off by saying, President Lula, don't worry, when we have the BRICS meeting, the issue of currency is top on the agenda, so we are going to discuss it. President Macron, I just want to start off on a very positive note in terms of what I think is evolving here. I think there is consensus that is clearly embraced by everyone that we need to address climate and poverty because they go together, there's a nexus. And as it were, we need to burn the candle on both sides. So that's important, so that's agreed. And we all recognize and accept that we need capital at scale to address the key challenges that many countries in the world face, particularly the developing economy countries. And we also would be agreed that there needs to be more cooperation and coordination between your development banks, multilateral development banks, and the private sector. There needs to be coordination so that there is no fragmentation, which you kept talking about. But I think what is important to many of us is that there should be solid consensus on the reform of the financial architecture of the world. Because without that reform, the dreams and the objectives that we have to address our challenges will not be realized. And those reforms need to touch on a whole range of issues. Mr. Mo Ibrahim yesterday even spoke about something that we may think is insignificant, that the boards of directors of your multilateral institutions are not made up of independent directors. They are largely internal people or shareholders. So that in itself, for us, it's an important reform. We also need to look at the distribution of the special drawing rights. I find it a bit difficult to be told that this is set in the rules and it will forever be like that, and that it's either you get 0 or you get 34 billion. In our view, this is not a zero-sum game. It's a game where we all need to be dealt with equity in an equitable manner. And there is a need for reform in that regard as well. And the other important thing for this to happen, it will help us not to participate as unequal cousins in these institutions. It will help us to participate fully, and so that we don't have a sense that we are beggars, that we are being dealt with out of generosity. I think it's important in the new era that the world is in now that there should be a good measure of equality among sovereign nations. You know, recently, 7 African countries decided to go and put a call for peace to Ukraine and to Russia. And we raised a number of issues. Zambia was represented, Comoros was represented, Republic of Congo was represented, Senegal was represented, Uganda, as well as South Africa. So we were all represented, and Egypt as well. So we were all at one, that even as we were going to address an issue of the war which has had a negative impact on the African continent, which is the rise in prices for food, rise in prices for fertilizers, we were clear that we are not going there as beggars. We're not going to ask for a favor to both Ukraine and Russia. We were going there to say, open up the Black Sea Channel so that the grains and the fertilizers should go into the world market. So we were not on a begging mission, even as we are in great need as a continent and all that. That should go to demonstrate that Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity. We want to be treated as equals. Even in the multilateral institutions, we want to be treated as equals. And if our equity is at a low ebb, there must be ways in which that can be addressed. To us, this is very important. Our sovereignty is one of the things that we hold on dearly to. And we demonstrated that very clearly to both President Zelensky and to President Putin when it came to this issue. Even as there were suggestions that, yes, we can donate this, we can donate that, we said, we want you to release these grains and fertilizers to the world market so that the world can trade in these commodities and other issues we can handle in a different way. I wanted to make that point so that it should be understood where Africa has evolved up to. We want to be key players on the world stage, want to be key players even in the financial markets and in the MDBs. Now, these are the positive things. I do, Mr. President Macron, want us to address another issue which to us is a bit of a negative. You will have heard President Sisi talking about the 100 billion that was promised in Paris. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday as well also spoke about it at the dinner. Now, there is that issue that a number of the commitments that have been made have not really been fully lived up to. But before I get into details, let me immediately say that we recognize the many initiatives that have been put on the table, and a number of countries here have done so. Germany has gone out of the way to put a number of initiatives, and the US has also done a number of things. But there have been times when we felt like we were beggars. I played a key role as chair of the African Union during the COVID period. We felt like we were beggars when it came to vaccine availability, when we felt we needed access to vaccines, and the Northern Hemisphere countries had bought all the vaccines in the world, and they were hogging them. And they didn't want to release them at the time when we needed them most. And we felt like we were begging. And at times it felt like they would just be droppings from the table, that yes, we will give you that and that. And let me tell you something that generated a lot of resentment. We resented that, and it got worse when we said we want to manufacture our own vaccines. And when we went to the WTO, there was a lot of resistance, enormous resistance. And we kept saying, what is more important, life or profits by your big pharmaceutical companies? And that too, I must tell you now, generated and deepened that disappointment and resentment on our part, because we felt like life in the Northern Hemisphere is much more important than life in the global South. And these are issues that need to be addressed. And I'm glad that we are all seated here like this, because we've got to get to the heart of these matters and address them. Now, I come to promises that have been made. And Chancellor Schulz was saying Scholz was saying we've got to walk the talk. Yes, we want to see the talk being walked. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday said at the dinner, $100 billion was promised per year. And he was saying, I've never seen that. And many of us will testify that that $100 billion has never really been made available. And this should stand out as something that needs to be addressed. Because sometimes we sit at conferences like this and say, yes, we'll make this available, and we believe you. We believe you, but now the tire must hit the tar. We must now see action flowing from that. Now, I want to then talk about something very practical. President Sassou Nguesso raised it yesterday. He said he would be happy if flowing from this summit, we do something very practical on the infrastructure side. Having said that 600 million people in Africa do not have electricity, and yet we've got all the resources to generate electricity, particularly the mighty Congo River, and that there have been plans to build a number of power stations that will generate, in my calculation, up to 70,000 megawatts. And he said, and I want to speak in support of this proposal, that to prove that these summits are not summits where we just talk, flowing from the Paris COP as well as others, let us now put money on the table and collectively say we are going to address this mega project. A mega project which will in the end generate electricity for up to 12, 15 African countries all at one go. And this is a project that I think the multilateral development banks here working together, the call that you've made, President Macron, can actually fund. And where, as we rise from this, we should be able to say the Inga Dam is now going to be developed into the Inga Power Station, the one that President Sassou Nguesso mentioned, and the next one as well. If we can do that, then we as Africans will now be convinced that these summits are really meaningful. We will now go home and say, you know what, it's worthwhile going to these summits, coming to Europe, and to listen to all the promises because they are willing to act on the promises. This is what President Macron, I believe, will be one of the most important outcomes. The reform of the financial architecture, as well as a practical project, infrastructure project that is going to add a lot of value. President Sisi and I have been talking about a railway from Cape Town to Cairo for years. We will leave that for the next summit, but the one on generating electricity and building power stations on the Inga Dam is the most important, that is immediate, that I believe needs to be addressed now. Let's get that done, and then we will be convinced that you are serious with the promises that you make. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, everybody. Mesdames et messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, mesdames et messieurs, en vos grades et qualités, il est temps maintenant de conclure ce sommet et je vais essayer, après les discussions d'hier, le dîner que nous avons eu et l'échange très fructueux qu'il y a eu ce matin, de faire une conclusion opérationnelle. Parce que
Thank you very much, and let me appreciate my brother Macron for putting this how dare you summit together. Our expectations of this a new global financing pact. What is our expectation? From the perspective from where I come from, we've had the testimonies from my dear sister Motley, from the Prime Minister of Pakistan, from the Sahel, from what is happening in Malawi, in Zambia, in Mozambique, what's happening in the Horn of Africa where I come from. We've lost millions of livestock because of drought. So climate change is real, no doubt. We're living through it every day. From where I sit, we need out of this summit, we need two outcomes. Number one, we need to agree on how do we get emergency liquidity, number one. How do we deal with debt that is saddling many developing countries? And how do we get additional money in the context of what Motley said in the morning, urgency and scale? Those two things we need just to answer. In my very respectful submission, I believe we should not leave this conference until we agree on what we are going to do to get many countries in the global south to at least be in a position to have a conversation by sorting out their immediate issues. And the immediate issues is there is no space for debt anymore. We need to deal with it. We need emergency liquidity in the context of where we are today, coming from the pandemic, getting into the war in Europe and getting into the climate change situation, the many crises we have to sort out, what we need to do urgently. The proposal I make is we need to reform the multilateral development financing institutions. The international financial architecture is not sitting pretty. UN Secretary General said on this podium this morning that there are countries that are paying 8 times in interest what the rest are paying. He was actually referring to those of us in Africa and largely in the global south. We're paying 8 times. And that is why our being in debt is not by default. We were set up by the system to be in debt. If you are paying 8 times, the chances of you being saddled with debt are 8 times higher than the next person. So how do we get out of this? Our suggestion is that before we leave here, let us agree, let us have a consensus on a win-win. The multilateral development banks have shareholders. Those shareholders cannot allow them to make certain decisions. So it's okay. So how do we keep the shareholders happy? Let us tell them, we will pay our debts. Give us 10 years or 15 years grace period and make the debt a 50-year loan. And we stop paying, we start with not paying the money we are supposed to pay next year. And they give us 10 years. What will happen is immediately the resources that we were supposed to pay for debt servicing become available to us to sort out the immediate issues. I'll give you an example. In Kenya, we are paying $5 billion every year to service our debts. If we got an opportunity not to pay the $5 not to pay the $5 billion, and it is made available to us to provide water, to provide electricity, to do development, we would have money at scale. And if it was done for 10 years, and we are given 20 years grace period, we would be sorted. And everybody will be happy. We will still pay our debt. It has just been postponed. So the shareholders have no problem. And we have immediate money to deal with our situation, so we are also not doing badly. So we can have a win-win. Hopefully, before we leave here, we have that agreement. I don't think it is unfair for us to ask. And I think it is a win-win. That's number one. Then we will go into the journey of reforming the multilateral development banks. We will even transform them. And I agree with Motley, it is possible for us to raise $500 billion to be able to plug into the gap that our restructuring of 10, 20 years or 50 years creates. So we can do that. It's so simple. Number two, our next expectation, so that we can have a better conversation in Nairobi, is to agree on climate financing. I know to a great extent what I have suggested as number one will go to a good extent in climate financing. But if we have to deal with the climate financing in the context of what we agreed in 2015, in the consensus we built out of the Paris Agreement, this Paris Agreement, where we get emissions down by 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. If we were to go there, IEA, which Kenya just became a member, tells us that we need $9.2 trillion every year for us to get to net zero by 2050. We have a gap of $3.5 trillion. How do we raise $3.5 trillion to be able to close that gap? And I'm very sympathetic to what you said. Let us have a global financing mechanism. Loss and damage will not do it. I'm sorry. It will not do it, because loss and damage is hostage to national interest. No nation is going to give money from its people to sort out a global problem. Because in a contest between national interest and global good, national interest wins in the morning. That's it. So what we did, and that is why we are not making progress ever since Paris in 2015, is because we had a global consensus on a global problem called climate change. But we tried to go and sort it out. We tried to sort it out using national institutions that are hostage to national interest, or we tried to use shareholder institutions that have shareholders who will make the decision finally. So we must get a new financial architecture around climate financing. We are saying we want one that does not bring the baggage and the toxic conversation of North versus South. We do not want a conversation that is going to take us to developing versus developed, emitters versus non-emitters. No. The rest of us from the African continent, we've always been in the corner of problems and victimhood. We don't want to be in that corner anymore. We want to be at the table where we are all looking for solutions. That is why we are in this conference. We have not come here to complain to anybody. We've come here because we want to look for a solution. We want to come up with a win-win. How are we going to arrive at a win-win? We already have suggestions on the table. IMF has proposed what they call carbon flow tax. The only challenge they have is that they have said it must be ratified by every country. I have a problem with that. We can have a carbon tax that is agreed as a treaty, and there is a way we can agree on it. The European Parliament have agreed on the financial transaction tax. We do not want to be the business of the Europeans. We want a global financial transaction tax where even us from the African continent, we pay. We want to pay. We do not want others to pay for us. So that once we raise the money globally, once everybody pays, if it is 1%, let all of us pay 1%. So that we can sit at a table, so that there are no shareholders. When IMF and World Bank were created in Bretton Woods in 1945, Kenya did not exist. It was only 44 countries then. Today, we have 190 countries. We want to contribute so that we can sit on the table and make the decisions so that we are not paying 8% more than others. Let us agree to pay the aviation tax. We have no problem. Let us agree on the shipping tax, and we want to pay. We don't want anybody to pay for us. We want to pay our percentage. It is only when we raise global finances that have no national interest for any particular country or shareholder interest of any person. That is how we are going to sort out this global challenge. Many people ask, so who is going to collect this money? So how is this going to happen? And let me dare say the following. After the Second World War, 44 countries, 740, I think 44 delegates sat in a small city called Bretton Woods. The World Bank and IMF did not exist. They created it in 3 weeks. The agreement was done in 3 weeks. Why is it difficult for us? Because there was, the whole of Europe had been destroyed. And so it was urgent and it was important for a decision to be made. Are we saying the crisis that we are going through, including what we just heard from the Prime Minister of Pakistan, is not serious enough for us to agree on a global financing mechanism that sorts out climate change as a problem that is affecting all of us? Are we saying ever since 1945, we have become stupid? Is that what we are saying? Or we have become less human, that we have no more feelings about what's going on? And many people are saying maybe we should do this incrementally. Maybe we should. Let me finally put this in context. The Bretton Woods institutions were agreed in 3 weeks. The UN that we today celebrate was a conversation by 50 countries in 2 months. Because it was necessary, because there were leaders that wanted and had the capacity to make decisions. Are we saying that we are incapable of making the decisions? that are required of us as leaders in the context of where we are today. I dare say between Paris and Nairobi, we have more than 3 weeks that were necessary to form the World Bank and IMF. We have more than 2 months that were necessary to agree on the UN Charter. We have actually 3 months. So my expectation is that we will agree in Paris and we will conclude in Nairobi. You asked me about my expectation. That's my expectation, that we will put this together. And please, for heaven's sake, we want a win-win outcome. We are tired of the blame game, finger pointing, North versus South. In any case, on this subject of climate change, there is no developed, there is no developing. We are all in trouble. And let me finalize by saying the following. And that is why it is necessary and urgent for us to make the decision now, is that we are not in the right trajectory. When we agreed in Paris in 2015 to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, what has happened? Today, Europe has done very well. You have reduced emission by 25%, by 20%. OECD countries have done well. You have reduced emissions collectively by 12%. But because the rest of the world don't have the money to do it, emissions have gone up elsewhere by 37%. So what happened to the 20% down in Europe? And what happened to the 12% down in OECD? Nothing happened, because overall, on average, the emissions went up by 17%. So we are not doing well. We are not going in the right direction. We are going backwards. So it is urgent that we all agree on how to go forward. And why specifically do we need to target taxing fossil fuel? Because it is the fuel, it is what is contributing 73% of all global gas emissions that are causing trouble in our globe. That's why we must go there. And that is the difficult conversation we must have, and we must have it in this Paris meeting and summit. Thank you very much.
When it comes to Africa, I'm sure many people in this audience will have made the same observations. I think we must take responsibility and accept our failures in dealing with these matters. For example, relating to what President Obasanjo has just said, on the case of Boko Haram, or you can use that for many other cases. For me, when I'm watching on television, and I find our leaders who should have been working together all along to address these problems that commonly affect their countries, wait until they are invited to go to Europe to sit there and just, it's like they are made to sit down and address their problems. Why does anybody wait for that? What image does it even give about us, about Africa? In fact, the image it gives is that we are not there to even address these problems. We are there for a photo opportunity. We are happy to sit there in Paris with the President of France and address, and just talk about addressing problems. It doesn't make sense that our leaders cannot get themselves together to address problems affecting our people. It doesn't make sense. Of course, I'm saying this painfully. On the other hand, that but I look forward for the time when I can be like the two former presidents. I think they are more free to say things than I. Being where they are and me being where I am. So I tend to remain with some reservations about what I have to say because, but I think there is that serious problem. African leaders, we don't need to be invited anywhere to go and address our problems without first inviting ourselves to come together to tell each other the actual truth that we must tell each other about our serious problems. So, I mean, again, look at the problem of South Sudan, indeed. The first problem was about this country and the people there wanting to be independent. They got independence. Now that turned into a problem. How? So you have one war being fought, waged to be independent, then you have to fight another when you have achieved independence. Just fighting among themselves. Why? So some of these underlying root causes should and could have been addressed by the leaders there. Whatever happened, whoever was wrong, that's not the issue. It is still the responsibility of leaders. If they can't resolve the matters themselves, why not? Why not call upon neighbors to say, come and help? We have a problem here. Maybe there is a problem between the president and the vice president. And if they can't resolve it, and each one thinks he's the one who is right and the other is wrong, and they are going to divide the army and the government and everybody else to go on either side and start fighting, well, I think in between the time that starts and when it actually happens, something can be done. But it has to be leaders to work towards that and avoid the catastrophe that, like we are seeing or have seen or that has already happened in South Sudan. But of course, the unfortunate part is that the most majority who suffer are the innocent people who have nothing to do with it. Women, children, and even many men are innocent in that situation. So this is, I'm not giving answers, probably I'm raising more questions than, or adding to others that have been raised. So for the time being, let me stop here. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Until next time.